Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here with you this afternoon, particularly as I arrived about 3.5 minutes ago. They were starting to get slightly panicked. You forget exactly how far east this place is. I have the pleasure of sharing with you some of the work that I've been involved with the CMI over the last couple of years around the issue of BAME and race. So I thought I'd kick off by just giving you a bit of context about how this came about and how we ended up with this focus specifically across the FTSE 100. Then I'd like to talk to you a bit about the output of our work and perhaps some broader observations about what we see happening in organisations today. And then I'd really like to open it up for us to have a conversation, because I'm as interested in hearing about your own experiences and your own observations about what you see happening in the world today. So about 2 years ago, the CMI approached me and asked me whether I would chair an advisory group they were bringing together to look specifically at the issue of race. They refer to it as BAME in organisations, and I think terminology is one of the areas of huge complexity that organisations are grappling with. So they use the terminology BAME. I know that every organisation talks about it in a different way. And at the time, I was working as an independent advisor to boards and excos and large corporate companies, specifically really at that stage looking more at the issue of gender and diversity. I've been working on the gender agenda for about 10 years, but my background prior to that was I spent 25 years in large corporate organisations leading all sort of the global talent, diversity, leadership, recruitment initiatives. So I had a lot of experience of being the person in the room trying to convince either a chairman or a CEO that this was a good thing to do. I also spent a lot of time being the person in the room that looked at a lot of faces, a lot of glazed looks, and oh my God, she's here again talking about the same stuff. So I'm sure you all experienced something similar. And the reason that the CMI at that moment in time were interested in doing this is that we'd seen a lot of progress in the area of gender. So it was probably around the time that Lord Davis had stepped down and Hampton Alexander had taken over on the issue of women on boards. They'd set a target for the pipeline. We'd sort of got to the target of around 25% for women on boards, and people started to look at the other diversity indicators, specifically looking at the issue of race. And the reason I was interested is that it's something that I felt organisations had been very silent about. So I don't know what your own experiences are, but I saw a lot of people spending a lot of time talking about women, but nobody talking about the other obvious issue, which was race. And frankly, in a lot of organisations I'd worked in, when you looked up at the very, very top, there were very few leaders of colour. I would often find myself, and I don't know if you're one of these individuals that find yourself in the same situation, where I would walk into a room and I would be the only person of colour who wasn't serving tea or coffee. And I was really uncomfortable with that, because I just thought, how can it be in such a diverse city, such as London particularly, with so many young people of colour leaving university, and nowadays so many more entering into large graduate programmes, particularly with professional services firms, with law firms, with banks, with big retailers. What is it that's preventing leaders of colour reaching the top? So for me, this was an area of huge interest anyway. So we convened a group of leaders, not just diversity experts, but senior business leaders from across the FTSE 100. And we brought them together and we said, is this an issue for you? And they said, yes, this for us is the next big thing that we will be tackling. If you've ever done doing any initiative, we kind of feel like we've done as much as we can at the moment around gender. We've still got some way to go, but we've put a lot of focus on it. And we recognise that from a wider societal perspective, this will be the next big issue. And so we saw that there was interest and we thought, great, let's go after this. The next thing we had to tackle is, well what are we going to answer for? What is the research we're going to conduct? And very quickly what we discovered is it was not going to be as easy as it was, for example, with gender. Because even when we started talking to group HR directors of some of the biggest companies and said, well, an obvious place might be to start looking at the data, most of them, over 75% of them, said to us, we don't even collate the data. Now, there are some obvious reasons for that, because it's not a legal requirement, because organisations find it difficult trying to think about the right terminology. I started work, because I'm much older than most of you in the room, I started work when there were 3 boxes, white, black and other. Luckily, it's a little bit more extended now, because I didn't actually fit into any of those, so I was struggling with that. So it's slightly more sophisticated, but we're not much further forward than that. I still work with companies today that say to me, we've still only got 3 boxes. So we kind of thought, well, we can't just only look at the data because, frankly, what sort of quantitative material are we going to get back if people aren't even collating it? So we thought we can't give up. We will ask for the data, but we'll ask for organisations to give it to us in any format that they have. And it meant poor people like Paul Wahida, who works at CMI, and others had to spend hours trying to sort of make sense of these numbers. But the thing we were really interested in was, well, what was the kind of real, everyday, what we called lived experience for leaders of colours in large organisations? And we very specifically decided to keep it to the FTSE 100 because we thought if they're struggling with the numbers and the data and knowing what the issues are, God knows what we're going to find when we get to the FTSE 250 and 350. So let's just start with the organisations that have big diversity teams, have more resources, have probably got more access to that sort of information, and then we'll roll it out over time. And we did a number of interviews, so what I call a diagonal slice, so, all through the organisation. We interviewed very senior people, we interviewed people that perhaps were in the early entry level of their career, and we wanted to get a sense of what is it like for you. And at one level, I would say I wasn't surprised by what came out of that, but I think how I genuinely felt, as someone who's been working a long time, I felt deeply saddened by the responses, because I felt, gosh, there's people like me and so many others, probably people like you in the room who care about this, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here, who've been working for a long time to make the workplace a more equal and meritocratic place. And what I felt coming back was that wasn't the case. But I think the other thing that surprised me is that the data we found and the responses we got weren't necessarily the obvious things. It was the really subtle things around race that people talked about, rather than, I feel directly discriminated against. So let me just share with you the highlights of sort of the main themes that came out of that and where we are now. So one of the major things that came out, and remember the CMI is an organisation that focuses predominantly on management, so although it's interested in leadership, its main purpose, or its raison d'etre, is around sort of middle managers. And one of the things they recognise is if the UK population is somewhere around 11% representation of BAME, for leaders of colour, they only represent 6% of all management positions. Now that is very low, because let's take London, for example. We know, just by being in an environment like here today, the numbers are much higher. They're probably closer to 20, 25. We also know that by 2030, BAME population in this country will be close to 20%. If all of the BAME population were actively engaged in the workforce, it could mean an extra 24 billion to the economy. So we know there's a huge prize to be had here. So we were really surprised at how low that number was, particularly given, as I said earlier, the efforts of many of the larger companies to try and make themselves more attractive and attract more leaders of colour coming in. The other thing we found is that when we looked at what was happening to people as they joined organisations and progressing, that the glass ceiling that we talk about for women was actually much lower. So what we found is that for BAME leaders coming in, the drop-off before they even got selected and appointed to first-line management positions or getting onto the career track or that trajectory of being in that sort of hypo pool happened much, much earlier. And I think that was quite saddening to me also, because what I heard leaders saying when we talked to line managers was, no, we've got a great, really diverse pool of people. If there's a certain group not coming through, it's because they don't want to. Now, I know that for a fact not to be true, and the data told us that wasn't true either. Then we got into the more qualitative conversations with leaders saying, well, tell us about your everyday experiences. And this was where I was really surprised. One of the strongest themes that came out was this sense that there is a cloak of secrecy, a silence effectively, that there is a reluctance to talk about this issue. Now, when we get into Q&As, I'd be really interested in your own experiences as you work with this issue. But what leaders said to us was, I just feel nobody even talks about it. So we could be in a meeting talking about diversity in our organisation, I'm quite senior, but no one even talks about race. So we could speculate, is that because people are uncomfortable talking about it? Is it because they don't know the right terminology? Is it because they don't see it? And frankly, the answers came back as all of those things. Line managers, who were also interviewed, by the way, in this process, said to us, frankly, I do feel uncomfortable talking about it because I don't want to offend anyone. So the PC brigade that have been condoning and promoting and encouraging all that sort of unbiased, unconscious bias training have left a lot of leaders feeling ill-equipped to have the right conversation. And it's an unintended consequence of someone having the right intention but having an unintended outcome, which is leaders saying, I'm so scared I might use the wrong phrase, the wrong terminology, I might offend someone, I might get a grievance against me, so I just don't say anything. And that's not helpful. And what BAME leaders told us is, I really don't mind, I'm not that sensitive. I would rather someone started the conversation, maybe tripped up, said the wrong thing, offered an apology and we move on. It's better to talk about it. So on both sides, there was this sense that everyone was sort of just talking around the issue and not discussing it. The other thing that came through was that BAME leaders said to us, you know, the reality about how my ambition shows up is very different to my peer group. So for example, with men and women, we know that men and women express confidence in very, very different ways. As a huge generalization, women are often described as being underconfident, which clearly isn't true. It's not that they're underconfident, it's that often in the workplace, men have a degree of overconfidence. And that's because it's expressed in a way that it's easy for people to see. And I have 2 little boys and I see it in them every single day. They believe they can do anything. And it starts with girls early. You know, girls don't ask for pocket money. So let's go figure why we've got a 35% pay gap. And it's widening at the top. So I think when you look at those issues, it's not as simple as saying, let's translate all the issues of gender onto leaders of colour and assume it's the same thing, because it's not. Because if I'm a woman, that's one whole level of complexity around my diversity. If I'm a black woman, that means something else. If I'm a black gay woman, that means something yet again. And so it's not like gender where you can say, well, that's a man and that's a woman. Here you have levels and flavours of what it means. So when we got into those conversations about ambition, one of the things that we heard people say was, well, you know, look, the way I see this is that I kind of put my head down and work really, really hard. But culturally, and particularly depending which generation you're from, and I'm the daughter of a first generation immigrants who had it really tough. So their messages to me were, work really, really hard, and if you've got a job, don't leave. My dad used to freak out every time I got headhunted and moved to another company. Why are you leaving? You've got a great job. And I'd be like, because it's another great job, Dad. And it's just a cultural thing that you're taught from a very young age, which is security is important, financial security is important. Don't put your head above the parapet. Don't be disruptive. Don't be difficult. And of course, I did all those things. But these subtle messages do make a difference if you're getting them every single day. So they sort of said to us, so I'm kind of waiting for my boss to tell me what I should do next. You know, to tell me which job I should apply for. Should I be a supervisor? Because I'm kind of on the shop floor in retail now. I'm kind of waiting for someone to say, maybe you could lead that section. And the boss is saying, he's really great, but I don't think he's that ambitious. Well, why do you say that? Oh, because he never kind of asked for anything. And so on both sides, there's this unconscious conversation going on in the head, which is both of them waiting for somebody to do something. Google have done some interesting work in this space. So we were with them last week. And what they've done is they've started opening up those conversations where they facilitate a conversation between the manager and the colleague to say, let's get that out there. And when it's out there, both of them have an aha moment. Okay, I get it. So I have to help you more and you have to put your hand up more. And they've actually seen an increase in people putting their hand up and putting themselves forward for promotion as a result. So that was one whole thing. We didn't hear very much about people saying there's lots of blatant discrimination in the workforce. I think, you know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s where it was happening all the time, everywhere, on the bus, at school, in the supermarket. I mean, I think, you know, people have become more sophisticated. It's more hidden. But I think there were colleagues telling us, however, I think there's this sense that people feel they know me, but they don't really know who I am. And that resonated with me because I would say as someone, you know, I'm Indian, but I think one of the reasons I was successful in the workforce is at the very senior levels, I adapted who I was to fit in. And it was only when I left corporate life that I felt far more comfortable to be who I was. And it took me to leave to reflect back on that sort of 25, 26-year career to say, why is it in a room of, you know, 100 white chairmen I feel very comfortable? And it's because I think I'm being somebody different. I'm being someone that I feel they can accept. I'm not really being true to myself. And young BAME leaders was telling us, I do that every day. And so when you ask, you know, perhaps a white colleague or line manager, Do you feel you know that individual? Yeah, I really know them. I know all about them. Well, they don't really, because they're not sharing who they really are. They're not talking about their experiences or the challenges they might have at home. And the problem is as well, what we have is on TV, people promoting things like, well, if you're an Indian woman, you must have had an arranged marriage. You know, your husband tells you what to wear. I mean, people still say this to me today, like they watch EastEnders and think that's how we live. That's sort of where they're getting their data from. So that was a whole issue too, about this lack of understanding and people not showing up as themselves. I think another area was around a sense that, well, there's no point applying because when I look up, there's no one that looks like me. And this, again, resonates with me because I would do a lot of graduate fairs. I'd be at Oxford, at Cambridge, wherever, and some young Indian guy or the one black person in the room would come up to me and say, I'm not going to apply because you're the only non-white person I've met in a week here. So frankly, why am I going to go and work in that organisation? And so this notion of real models rather than role models, people can connect with, that they can see, makes a big difference. And what we also know from our work on gender is just having one isn't enough. So if you've got one woman on Exco, it makes zero difference because people see that person as almost unachievable. And it's the same if you're a black woman or a black man, which is, well, I look up and there's one person and they've almost made it in spite of all the challenges they've had. There's not a critical mass. So you need more than one. So you need at least 30%. You need broader representation of that minority group for people to feel that they connect with them. And so that was another theme that came through. And I think the other thing I would say is we heard a lot from organisations, so HR directors saying, we are really struggling to think about how do we encourage colleagues to actually self-report around race, because there is no a compliance issue that they have to do it. So some organisations, as one of the big professional service firms, one of the big four, they had a bit of an amnesty and they said to their colleagues, well, look, we can't do anything about this. And by the way, this is a firm where out of 600 partners, one was black. They said, we can't change this unless you help us by self-reporting on race. And of course, people were saying, well, I don't self-report because I'm afraid that it'll be held against me. So there's a real reason why I don't do it. I don't not fill the box in because I'm trying to be difficult. I don't not fill the box in because, by the way, I'm the only one Chinese woman in a team of 300. It's pretty obvious who I am. And you have to ask me that question. So on both sides, there was this sense of reticence to be open about who they really were. But it was pretty simple things that can be fixed. And I'll give you another Google example because they're a case study in our research. One of the things that they discovered is that for colleagues who'd been in the organisation a while and they could see from a race perspective they were not getting promoted, they knew that it was probably to a degree some unconscious bias going on. So a bit like all the numerous organisations that today at entry level are taking names and colleges and university data off CVs in order to increase the numbers of BAME leaders going in, they thought, well, let's do something similar. So they said, if someone's got more than 7 years work experience and they've proved themselves and they've met all our requirements in terms of minimum level, of intellect and every other dimension we need, they've done that by being hired by us because they hire smart people, right? They said at that stage, we'll take the data off and then we'll ask leaders to choose who they want to select in the pool for promotion. And what they found is the reason they did that is that they're a very global business, that across Europe and across the US, and this again is a generalization, if someone had come from a BAME background and they came from a position of economic hardship, the chances were they didn't go to an Ivy League or a red brick university for obvious reasons. The second thing is they probably had to work through their university degree, which again is to support themselves financially, which means they weren't in the library studying 12 hours a day, and my stepson isn't doing that, so I guess most people aren't doing that anyway, but invariably they didn't have as much access to that free time to study. So they were doing well, but they weren't necessarily all graduating with a first. And if you're in an environment, particularly saying, let's take investment banking, where there's a badge of honour to say, oh yeah, I picked the top 10%, I cream off the smartest graduates. Well, guess who you're excluding all the time? Those people who are equally smart but didn't have access. That's also an issue around social mobility in this country, right? You don't have to be BAME to feel that. You can be someone who went to a second-rate university and still really bright, but you didn't get a first, and you're still excluded from society. If you've got a regional accent, there are lots of things that impact people. So what they did is they took the data off, and what they found is those people then got into the selection pool, and when they were met by leaders who were really interested and they got promoted, then they've been tracking these individuals, and what they found is 3 years or 2.5, 3 years into the job, they are more successful because they have tenacity, because they've been through hardship, because they've had to fight, because they really want it. So they're able to prove with their data that this has been a successful strategy. So in summary, so I can stop so we can get into a bit of a conversation, I would say that on the back of this research, what we've been able to do is start a conversation. So we've had a huge amount of interest. We did a launch at the House of Lords in the summer. We've been inundated with requests from organisations to say, can you come and talk to us? Can you come and help us? We are at the beginning of this journey, and frankly, we are struggling. So one organisation last week, I went to meet with them. They said, we've got together a BAME network, and we had a great launch, and we've got our next meeting coming up. We don't actually know what to do. And I think, well, you know what, that's a great place to start, isn't it? At least they're starting somewhere. But interesting, because on the issue of women, the network's becoming very unpopular. People are actually disbanding their female networks because they're realising that just having them for the sake of having them makes zero difference, particularly if there's no men present. So the same issue around race, right? If you're just a group of people who are in the one group and you're talking to each other about how it can be, if the leaders aren't in the room listening to your experiences, if the people who make the decisions with the power aren't in the room, it makes zero difference. So I still applaud them. It's a great place to start. And so what we did is talked about what are some of the simple steps that they could do and they could go through. So we've now convened a group called CMI Race, and we are kicking off with a set of goals around what we want to try and do around education, campaigning, influencing, whether that's government, whether that's employers, and whether that's working with BAME leaders themselves to help them understand and think about what are the things they can do for themselves. Because actually, unlike gender, where we tend to say things like, oh, well, women lack confidence, they're not very ambitious, they're only really good at teamy stuff, they're not very commercial, they can't run P&L, all of which is nonsense. I personally think, in my experience of work with young BAME leaders, there are some things we can help and coach and support because they're massively under-sponsored, but they're also under-mentored, whereas women are over-mentored and under-sponsored. So for the BAME community, they're getting very little support and very little access, and they don't know how to work the organisation. So I'm going to stop there just because we could just go on and on and on. And I think it'd be more interesting to hear from you. So I'd love to hear your observations, reflections, and perhaps a little bit about what maybe you're doing or what you're seeing, and any questions you might have. You can always guess who's going to ask the first question. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for kicking off.
Well, it starts something off, doesn't it? Loud mouth like me. Thank you for all that. I was going to make just a couple of points. One was that we've just done some work in a health trust. Mm-hmm. We are doing some work in a health trust. 15% of the local population is black and minority ethnic. About 20% of the workforce of the trust is. There are no black people in the top 3 layers of management at all. Lots of consultants, but absolutely no, no matrons, no clinical, blah, blah. So we went in and we asked people, what does the trust do to answer your ambitions? It's, we ask questions like that.
Yeah.
Have you experienced disadvantage on the basis of who you are, and so on and so forth? And something came up again and again and again in the free text. And it was jobs for the boys, and it depends who you know.
Yeah.
When we delved down into this, we realised that there's a real culture of informal appointments.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I told the story is that what is happening, which is ethnically and racially disadvantaging, is not starting out with that as an intention. In other words, there's a process point here, which is about how you get to the bottom of what's making the deficits happen. So there are questions, I think, of people being explicitly encouraged and so on and so forth. But I suppose I would just encourage that approach to actually always burrow underneath and find out what is happening to people in their everyday experience. And that means you then make a very explicit invitation to them to move up. And also, in that case, we've tried to put help them put some process in, so that actually they're not just the consultants and whatever, not just appointing the people that they've known for a very long time. And the other point I would just make is to your point about strivers, I suppose. There's a great TEDx talk, actually, where HR director comes out and says, I'm going to talk about strivers, which I shouldn't do because I am one. And then she goes on about the benefits of strivers. That emphasises to me that people aren't good at, organisations are not good at deciding who they actually want.
Yeah.
And so the criteria of who you want, and therefore when you go and look for them, seem to be fundamental to advancing the opportunities for black people and or BME people, or whatever phrase Hannah called it something. So that was just an insight into why the deficit's happening, and we find it very, very revealing. So I don't know whether it's a help. But
I think it's very powerful, actually. And your first analogy, I love the example of getting underneath, because frankly, you see it in the corporate world. So there is a small clique of headhunters who control all the chair and CEO and board and NED appointments. And unless you're tapped into that, how on earth do you get yourself on a shortlist? And the way it works is that, as you know, at the very, very top in British business, the headhunter rings someone like you or me and says, well, who do you know that could do this job? well, if I only know 17 other white middle-aged men, who am I going to recommend? I'm going to recommend the people I know. And so part of the chair challenge is they then go back and say to the chair, well, they say, why are there no women on those? Oh, well, no, there are no women. No, sir, whatever. There's certainly no black people. There's definitely no women. And I laugh when I hear this because I think, really? Well, I could give you a list of 25 now. And for those of you that don't know, the Parker Review obviously says that by 2021, every UK board in the FTSE has to have a leader of colour on it. You know, out of 1,011 non-execs, we have 11% who are BAME. So we haven't got very long. So if everyone you know that think you might be suitable, get them ready now. So I think you make two very powerful points, so thank you very much. Any other? Oh, we have a gentleman here at the front.
Peter Reichwald from Harvey Nash. I'm Peter Reichwald from
Hi,
Harvey
Peter.
Nash, and I lead our ethnic minority network as well as a lot of our other inclusion work. And we did a survey of that network, which was really quite fascinating and was quoted in the Parker report because there isn't that much evidence from that community around. But I think one of the strong messages was a recognition from within the group that we have to do something as well. And it's a case of not just sitting there and expecting it to happen. People need to know what your aspirations are. And that's a real important message to begin with. So when you are going through any sort of appraisal, it's a sort of question, well, what do I need to do to get to X or Y? And very often there's hesitancy in doing that with the immediate line manager. And so there's an argument that says it's who is above that, who should be looking at it. There is another aspect as well. And I found this, and dare I say it, but let's be realistic here, it happens with some of the ethnic minority communities more than with others. It's about being seen beyond your own desk area. So if there is a group going out after work for a quick drink, some characteristics say, I've got to go home at 5:30, I'm expected to do A, Y, and whatever it may be. But in actual fact, that's missing an opportunity of meeting a wider group of people within the workplace. And therefore, line managers don't know you better, and therefore don't think about you when there's another internal opportunity going around. So it's all about a much wider thinking of how do I get myself known, and how do people learn more about me, because that way you cross from one area of activity into another. Harvey Nash were quite good at moving people from one area of work into another. But I think those are some of the messages. And on my last point, it's really about the hiring managers, particularly those hiring at middle level. They are targeted purely KPIs, primarily on money. And it's about time we change the method of the KPIs. And I would be saying, and I say it to CEOs as well, what you need to do is say, all right, you didn't hit your target, but you've increased inclusiveness within your team. And if you've done that, that will not penalise your target. And I think there's a very big message there, because I think we heard it earlier this morning. People are risk adverse. They're not keen on going outside of their own thought processes. But if something like I've just suggested comes forward, that will enable people to be able to take a bit of a risk, but no, it's not going to be critical necessarily to their KPIs and their own target.
Thank you. I'd just like to add that I'm a support of everything you said. I think the only thing I would add is that I'm a big believer that we don't try and fix people, we fix culture. So if we work in organisations that require us to go to the pub for our boss to know us better, I think it's the culture that's strong, not the individual. So I think there's enough hours in the day that line managers have to work harder to get to know their people. And actually, I think that is changing, and that's good, because I think whether you're a man or a woman or whatever race, that shouldn't be the only way. And I think those sort of in-groups exist even inside workplaces. It can happen. So there was a lady at the back, at the very back with the glasses. You had your hand up did you have your hand up? Yes, you had your hand up for a long time. And then we'll come forward to everyone else had their hands up.
I think, to be honest, you just made the point that I was going to make about, the after-work drinks culture. And this isn't even just about race and ethnicity. This is about, parents like me who have to run back and pick up their children from 3 different places at the end of the day. And I completely agree with you. There are enough hours in the day for you to see the quality of the work of the people that you work with. So I think it's a bit disingenuous arguing that, because actually structurally, we're not set up always, wherever we are, to have those after-work drinks. and some of us don't drink, some of us have to drive. But aside from that, I think the first point made around the idea of the striver, and it's a very liberal idea that, those who strive succeed. Well, this places the responsibility on the individual to always be battling the organisation that they happen to find themselves in. And I think that's also deeply disingenuous, because actually we have to look at the system in which they are striving. If the system is set up in a way not to recognise their efforts, if it's set up in a way to give to the jobs to the boys, then it doesn't matter how much you're striving or how excellent your outputs are. You're just not in that place where your excellence is being recognised. So there's something about recognising strivers, but there's something about a system that genuinely recognises the real strivers and the achievers as well.
Yeah, it comes back to culture, doesn't it? Did you want to respond? How did you hold your hand?
Well,
And then
only that I didn't
that
want to give
lady
the impression that you took from it. The point about strivers is, it seems to me, is that what they've gone through is not valued, whereas what's rewarded is stuff that actually people find quite easy. So if you go to a good school and get 3 A's, everybody thinks you've done brilliantly. It's that kind of thing. So what I'm suggesting is that one values different things, and life experience is every bit as important, it seems to me, because you've demonstrated resilience, your ability to want it, all those kind of things, rather than actually the lazy proxies that people use from people like me who went to public school and go, oh, well, Fontaine, you must be clever. No, thick as old whatnot. This, I was trying to tilt the balance there.
There's a lady here with the glasses, and then we'll go to the lady at the back.
Hi, thank you for that. That was really insightful. I really related to the point around the HRDs who shared that data collation was difficult and that actually often they were tackling with people not wanting to self-report because of the challenges in the current cultural dynamic. At the same time, so we've experienced that in my organisation. At the same time, there's a bit of an ask for diverse shortlists and for us to have every single shortlist be diverse. And I have a hesitation around that because I feel like I don't want to be prescriptive about what a diverse shortlist is. And I just wondered if there's anything from the organisations that you've spoken to around, absolutely, let's increase the opportunity to attract a wider pool of talent that is more diverse. But how do you tackle that diverse shortlist bit, and how do you define it without the data to say
it is?
Need it?
I think it's a very double-edged sword. So I'd say every day someone will ring me and say, I've been put on a shortlist for X job, and I go, great, no, it's really obvious, I'm just making up the numbers because I'm a black woman. Exactly. And so I think it's difficult because I think, to be fair to the search community, they're working hard to address the issue of broadening their network and pool. And I think sometimes they also know that their client is also going through the motions, so it's difficult because they're in between a rock and a hard place. But I think it lacks transparency with the candidate themselves as saying, I'm just here to make up the numbers. But equally, I think you can't create change and you can't disrupt the current status quo unless you shake the tree a bit. And I think sometimes you have to intervene in quite a directive way. So I used to work at Shell, and one of the things we did a long time ago when everyone thought the world began and ended in Holland and London, in the Netherlands, was to say that for what they then renamed as most of the world, which was frankly everything outside London and Shell Centre, because go figure, it is most of the world, that there must be one woman and one local leader on every team. And the whole place imploded, like, oh, the world's coming to an end, we'll never survive, this is worse than the reserve crisis. But of course they did survive. And now, sort of 10 years on, what you see is promotion and a more natural movement of talent. Now, in that, did some people slip through the net? I'm sure they did. I mean, I worked in South Africa at a time that was very difficult, where we had to put local leaders on, and it caused all sorts of challenges and issues. But if you're going to change culture, you have to go through that, and it takes time. And equally, I would say, let's take any other, a really traditional institution like the health service, for example. Are you telling me that no mediocre men have ever been appointed? Well, that hasn't happened either, has it? So it happens, doesn't it? Talent is a game of taking a risk and judgment. There's a lady at the back that had a question, and then I think Wahida had one, and we might be we'll have a couple more minutes after that. So should we go to the lady at the back?
Just clarify
Yes.
the point that you made about Google when you said they facilitated something between line managers and employees. Was that just on ethnicity?
It was. They do some amazing work on gender as well. I'm happy to sort of cover that with you offline. But that specific example is about trying to address issues around race.
Hi, so my colleague and I work in civil service talent, but I also have a lot of involvement in some of our cross-government diversity networks. And I think one of the things I found quite interesting I'm particularly involved in the sort of social mobility agenda, but also we do a lot of work in our teams around ethnicity and disability, is we're getting quite good at promoting really positive role models, which I think is fantastic, and it helps to kind of show people more of the diversity that we do have, particularly in senior roles. But we tend to swing quite wildly towards something you've just mentioned about mediocrity. We swing quite wildly to the very high potential, high performers, and what you find in the networks is you get this feedback around they feel like they constantly have to be outshining, they constantly have to be visible, they constantly have to be a top performer to be just considered okay for a promotion. As you say, not everyone in a middle management role is going to be one of your top 10% of performers. So why is it that when you feel that, you know, if you are either from ethnic minority background or low socioeconomic background or whatever it might be, but you feel like just to be considered in the same space as other people who aren't necessarily your top performers, you have to be right at the very top just to enter that space. And that's putting a lot of pressure on people who feel like they just can't compete and can't do that. And there's something about promoting a little bit of mediocrity, if that's the right way to call it, for everyone. Because actually people feel like if I'm not right at the top, there's no point, basically. There's no middle ground between performing well and being able to progress a bit, or just being amazing and have to be right at the very top of the organisation. There is none of that middle space, whereas there are other people who don't see that because there are people like them everywhere throughout every level of the organisation. And that's the bit that I find quite sort of difficult to tackle, which is we're promoting a lot of stories about people who've been through some incredibly difficult life experiences, and that just has started to kind of amplify the feeling that I must have come from a really hard background and be absolutely fantastic every single day of my life and do stuff outside work too to get promoted. And there's a little bit of, maybe we just need to temper that a little bit so that it doesn't feel so impossible.
Well, or maybe not, because I would argue you just telling that story is so powerful. So I think if you were sat in a room of people who were more representative of the broader community which you work in, and all levels of mediocrity, and people who are high performers and those who are stars and those who you might exit, and them hearing that makes a difference. And you can't be what you can't see. So if you don't promote people to the next level, then nobody looks up and sees anyone. It's a catch-22. So I would say doing exactly what you're doing, but talking about that very point will make the difference. There was, Wahida, you had a point, didn't you?
I wanted to ask the floor, given we're talking about race and ethnicity, what about generationally? We're talking about millennials now. We're talking about a generation of young people who have a global mindset, who are non-drinkers because of health reasons, who are vegans, etc. You have this new talent pool who have expectations of their culture being transposed onto the workplace culture because that's what they want and that's what they will get. And I think that will change the way in which we approach recruitment.
Any thoughts? I would agree with you, Wahida. I think it's a talent issue. So most of the companies I work with now are not doing this because they think it's a nice thing to do. They're doing it for purely commercial reasons, because they need to represent the communities which they serve, the colleagues in their workforce, but more importantly, the future talent pool, the fact they won't be able to attract the future talent unless they change. There was somebody else with a hand up. Was it you, sir, with your... Okay, do you want to share the mic? Okay. Any final questions? Oh, here we go. Lovely, the lady in the lovely red top.
Thank you. Because I walked out a bit, maybe you might have answered it. You were talking about fixing the talent pipeline for black and minority managers. I've been in a scenario where I've been in an interview and the situation was so obvious that a black person was actually a filler in that position and interview. And she excelled very well, but she didn't get the job. It was very difficult for them to make a decision during my presence in that interview. I actually felt that I had to walk out for a decision to be made. And I knew the decision. But anyway, she didn't get the job. Now, this person who didn't get the job, of course, I know she's got all these lists of routes that she can take if she's not happy with the result. But after speaking to her, it's like she's not allowed to get the kind of like the results of
the feedback.
Feedback, yes.
Can I ask why you walked out? Why did you feel that you needed to walk out for your colleagues?
Obviously, that they are failing to say they can't give her the job.
Yeah. But you see,
during my
I think that's the point at which you should have stayed. Because this is a discomfort, I think make it worse, make it harder. You know, have the conversation. Because frankly, we can only change this stuff one conversation at a time. And we have to be brave and courageous and call stuff out. And I call stuff out with people every single day. Because I think unless I do, I have a responsibility to, nothing's going to change. And it's hard, because it's hard for you in that situation. You've still got to work those people. But I think, you know, to sit with that level of discomfort and just say, well, what's the issue? Let's talk and get into specifics. Use data. What is it about her experience? What is she lacking? What do the other candidates have that she doesn't? Because what people do is they go into a downward spiral and they can't. They argue themselves out of it. So my advice to you is next time, please don't leave the room.
Yeah, my question now comes back to say, where do we go for that kind of help for us not to be, like, for example, for me, not to be doing that? I know, obviously, from that day, I said to myself, next time I will not do that. But is there support for me? Is there support for the lady who didn't guess?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say immediately has to be inside your organisation. That's the first place to go. So I don't know if you have a good HR department, but I would go to your HR team, because perhaps what you need is a moderator in that wash-up conversation. So one of the things I do is I sit in with boards who are actually having those decisions, and I call out the things I hear, whether it's gender or race. You know, and I think if you're struggling with that, then a line manager you trust in the organisation to go to and talk to them, a mentor. Outside of the organisation, there are companies like the CMI, you know, who are professional bodies who have loads of great online resources and tools. I mean, I think we should probably take it offline. You can talk to Wahida and Patrick, who's sitting just behind you. So there are tools and resources, but I would always say go inside your organisation first and then look outside for support.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got one last one. The lady, the 2 rows back there.
Hi, I really liked your kind of suggestion around sponsorship. And I think there's an increasing commitment and value to that, where we have seen sponsorship of women making a difference. But I wonder whether you had any thoughts or suggestions or advice around how we can increase the confidence of leaders in sponsoring BME staff within their organisation.
I think sponsoring is a really complex relationship, because it's not like mentoring. I don't just agree to meet you for a coffee and impart my wisdom and have a chat and I'll check in. It really is where I put my professional reputation on the line for you. And frankly, you know, I'm maybe only going to do that once or twice or 3 times in my career for someone I really, really, really believe in. And so it's much more of a two-way street. So I think this is where the person does have to be outstanding, whether a man, woman, black, white, whatever. They have to be able to demonstrate that they're operating at the highest level in terms of their potential, their capability. So I think before you get into any conversation, you have to have the aspiration as well. You know, you have to want to say, I want to be at the top of that organisation. And then I think that individual has to feel that they can put their reputation on the line in a way that they will not damage themselves. So does that person have any capital or social capital with the rest of the executive in that business, in that organisation? If they stand up and say, I'm backing X, is everyone going to say, well, who's X? Which invariably was what happens with women. Everyone says, well, I don't even know that person. How can we promote them? And if you're a BAME candidate, it's even more likely they're going to say, who's X? So I think, yes, you know, BAME individuals can do more to think about what support are they getting to get greater sponsorship, but it is a two-way street, and I think it comes at a very high mutual price for individuals to work together for a long time to really get to know each other. I think we're out of time. I had the lady winding up at me, so I think that means stop talking. Thank you so much for your engagement, your energy and your commitment to this cause. I'm here for another panel session a bit later, so I'm sure I'll see you wandering around having a coffee a bit later. But thank you very much for your time and your attention. Thank you.